This is the Long Island Retro Gaming Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of the Long Island Retro Gaming Podcast. Returning as a guest today is our very good friend Jorge Portugal, also known as One Up Restorations, also known as the lead preservationist for Long Island Retro Gaming, also known as, I think I've seen people on Facebook call you the God. So, I don't know.
I don't know about that.
Well, just saying, you're a man of many titles. And George is going to tell us a story today about a Pong arcade machine that has an interesting history, an interesting chance encounter, and a wonderful conclusion. So I'm not really going to get into a lot of lead up here because I don't know a lot. So
yeah, sure.
So let's so where did Pong arcade machine, super old, where'd it come from?
Sure. Well, it was a great story. So it's kind of the direct product of the expo that we had last year. And so as we talked about in my earlier podcast, I had repaired Computer Space, and we had managed to get it for the 2019 expo, and it was at the absolute last minute. And it was great. We got tons of people coming there, and one of the people that happened to see Computer Space was a guy named Bill Ainge, and he's a huge Atari fan. He lives in Jersey, and he comes to the expo, I think, every year, I think. And I think actually he spoke to you first, so it's kind of funny. Just like the Computer Space story, this starts with you.
Okay. Sorry, guys. That's my bad. Yes, I remember. So I'm walking around the floor, just looking for fires to put out because that's all I do, right?
Yep.
And I just happened to, I was on the second floor around the music area, and I don't know if I just happened to say something like, "How you doing?" or it was like a comment like, "Oh, this is pretty cool," or "That's really nice over." It was something like we said to each other, and he said, "Let me ask you a question. I have this old thing. It's not working. Like, do you know anyone who maybe could help me out?" So right away I'm like, in my mind, because I'm in fire mode, I'm like, here's a fire. I know who could put this fire out. So
Right.
I walked them right over to you. I introduced you, and then I walked away. So now ball's back in your court.
Yeah, so that was it. Yeah, you just put us together, and we started talking, and he told me that he had recently acquired a Pong arcade machine, and I was just like floored because I'd literally just fixed Computer Space, and in the back of my head I was thinking, geez, how nice would it be to have a working Pong machine right next to Computer Space, or just to work on some of these. Like I kind of became fascinated with this Bronze Age of arcades. It's what people refer to as, this early period from 1971 to about like 1978, and all the games are black and white. They're all TTL logic based with no CPU, and they're all really interesting, and they have their own special kind of story. And really, that's where video games started. And so, I had gotten that in my head, and I wanted to fix more of those machines. And then here comes this guy who not only has one of those, he has Pong. And I'm like, wow, this is great. So I talked to him about fixing Computer Space, and I was like, yeah, after the show, I'd be more than happy to take a drive down to Jersey and meet you, and we could like take a look at it. And so, yeah, basically about like a week after the show had ended, I took the drive out to Jersey where he lives, and yeah, like he's probably the biggest Atari fan I've ever met to date. Like he has this absolutely phenomenal collection of Atari stuff, all sorts of rare and obscure documentation, and every possible system you could imagine. He's got several arcades, and meanwhile, I mean, I'm kind of going there expecting to see a full-sized machine, and he's like, okay, so here's Pong, and all I find is like this little box, and I'm like, what do you mean this is Pong? And then he's like, well, this is what I got. So he told me that he had gotten the game from somebody named David All, and at the time, I didn't know who that was at all, but later on, I learned that he was somebody who was kind of at the very forefront of early video game history. So when he was a young man, he used to work at a at a company called DEC. And if you don't know what that company is, it's yeah. So most people don't. It's a company that used to make mainframe computers. So these are those computers you see pictures of from the 40s and 50s that are literally the size of an entire room. They used to cost $1 million.
The big tape reels, like
exactly, like these gigantic tape reels. And actually, the term bugs for computer failures comes from mainframe computers because sometimes literally bugs would end up in some of the vacuum tubes.
That's incredible. I did not know that.
Yeah. So he used to work at this company, and during his tenure at that company, he started learning about some very preliminary video games, some of the very first video games that were ever made, including one called Space War, which was developed at MIT. Space War was made, I think, in the early 60s. It's actually what inspired computer space.
Quick side question.
Yeah.
Is there a relation between computer space and Pong, or they just happen to be two early games?
No, there's actually quite a lot of connection between the two games. Yeah, and I'll get to that actually too, because I used that connection to fix Pong.
Yeah. So sorry, keep going.
Yeah. So this guy David, he worked at DEC. He had a passion for games when they basically barely existed, and so eventually he left DEC and he created a magazine called Creative Computing, and it's also something that's kind of before our time because you and I are from the 80s, but Creative Computing was like one of the very first popular magazines for personal computers. It was like right there at the forefront of the home computer revolution that happened in the late 70s. So yeah, bottom line, this guy has a connection to early video games and to early computing in the home, and even before that. So he owned this Pong machine. I knew nothing more, and at the time, Bill didn't know anything else either. So he's like, this is where I got it from. It came to me in this state. I tried turning it on. It doesn't work.
So it was just like a. So this was originally an arcade machine. So this was just like the panel or a box or.
Yeah. So it was like in a little triangular kind of box, and so we just had like the front panel, which is like where the where the dials are for the game. You have these two potentiometers that control the paddles for the game, and so we had that piece. And it was in a little wooden box, and so at the time I didn't know anything else. And so it wasn't until I got home and I opened it up with my screwdriver, and then I saw inside of the box was the game PCB. It was the original Pong syzygy, which is also the name for Atari at the time, circuit board. So it was just the circuit board and the control panel and nothing else. And I was like, okay, so what the hell am I going to do now, basically? Because I had, I kind of expected an arcade machine, and that's what I got. So yeah, this is kind of the part of the story where my experience with computer space lended itself very much towards how I fixed Pong. So computer space comes from this time before arcades. It's the very first commercially made arcade game. And so these guys did everything DIY when they built it. So they took a regular off-the-shelf TV, they hacked it so that it would receive composite video instead of RF. And so I reasoned that Pong probably worked the same way because it was only a year later and there were no professional arcade monitors yet. That happened in like 74, 75. So I figured maybe the same tricks I used to get an image from computer space could be used for Pong. So I actually, the next day, I went back to the Cradle of Aviation and I pulled some of the pieces from that I no longer needed from computer space. And I used those to take the video and audio output from Pong and connect it up to modern television. Well, reasonably modern, like mid-90s.
Right.
And I got an image. And so the game was actually in far better shape than computer space. So it would show me the attract mode, which is where it shows scores, and sometimes those scores are garbled, and that's also normal for Pong, and the ball just bounces around the court and there's no paddles, and that's like its attract mode. And so I was like, okay, maybe this thing isn't even broken at all. This is awesome. So then I looked at the wiring harness and I figured out which two wires were related for like the coin slot, and basically with those, if you just cross them and short them together, you get the game registers a coin, and then you can start the game. So I started doing that, trying to short the wires, and the coin counter would advance, but I wouldn't get out of attract mode. So the game was definitely broken, because it couldn't start. It wasn't starting. So so from there, I kind of took a break because I didn't know anything yet about the game, and I do what I normally do, which is read. so I did some searching. I found the game schematics, and kind of similar to Computer Space, it's all handwritten stuff. It's easier to read than Computer Space because that's honestly like that schematic is like gobbledygook. It's really badly written. But thankfully, someone also, similar to Computer Space, someone online had taken Pong and put it in a modern kind of schematic language, which is far easier to read. And so I started reading that and tracked it down to, basically there's this one chip which, if it's in one state, the game is in attract mode, but if it's in another state, then it goes into gameplay mode. And so I started probing that around, and so every time I shorted the wires for a coin, it was supposed to go from low to high on my logic probe, and just stayed low. So that told me that probably the chip was bad. So I ordered the part. It's like a $2 part on DigiKey, and popped out the chip and replaced it. And at first I still didn't have anything, and so I thought, okay, maybe it's another issue. And it turned out it was just something minor. Like there's a transistor that also connects to that chip, and the solder had kind of gotten worn out, and there was no longer a connection. So all I had to do was just retouch that up, and that was it. And then Pong was basically working. I did some other things like replace capacitors because they were old, and the ball was erratic with the old caps, and then when I put in the new capacitors, the ball moved like all nice and smooth like it's supposed to. Right. But that was actually it. So the actual electronic comparing it to Computer Space was a cakewalk. I had it done within like 2 or 3 days. The challenge from there was the fact that I had a piece of wood and a PCB, and I wanted an arcade machine. and so that was when things got really crazy.
I think it'd be like looking at having like a picture of the whole arcade machine in one hand and the PCB in the other, and just like looking back and forth. What do I do?
Exactly. And I mean, you know me, like my forte is electronics. I don't have that talent of working with wood and that kind of stuff. I mean, I can kind of do it, but I'm an amateur. That is not my strong suit. The good thing is that it is my father's strong suit. And so what I ended up doing was, I have done some woodwork, and I was like, what, maybe I can do this myself. And so I was like, he was like, I can help. And I was like, let me try this. So I started by myself and with like, well, not by myself, but with the guys at the Cradle of Aviation, because they do have a woodworking shop there. So with some effort, we found the schematics for the actual cabinet, like the actual measurements of it, all the dimensions. And I started doing research on what the materials were. And so I started buying all the, requisite pieces to make a Pong arcade cabinet. And so what we did, so yeah, at first I was going to try to go for it and build it myself because, I really wanted to learn more about woodworking, and I thought like, okay, maybe I can handle this. Like Pong doesn't look too complicated in terms of building the cabinet. And so my dad was saying, let me help. And I was like, no, let me try to do this on my own first.
It's always harder than you think, right?
Oh God, yes, it was. I was not ready. So I started with all the basics. I did my research and I picked up all the necessary parts for building the cabinet. And thankfully, someone online posted very detailed measurements of what a real Pong arcade is like. So I had all the raw materials I needed to build the arcade machine. And so I started by doing this at the Cradle of Aviation. So what we did was we took all the materials to Hangar Bay 5, and if you know exactly what it's like there, but basically it's just like a storage area for the museum. And so it's a really kind of cool place. They have, a couple of airplanes in there, and all sorts of oddball things from various events that have just accumulated over the years. And then of course they have a woodworking shop, which is where we were going to be building this machine. And at first we started making some of the larger panels, like the side panels and stuff. And very quickly it became clear that that it wasn't going to work to build it there because, they really didn't have the right tools, and like or their tools were kind of old and worn out, so I wasn't getting really precise cuts. And then also, like, the three of us just don't know what we're doing. Like, like Seamus is fantastic, and we tried our best, but it just wasn't coming out quite right. So I kind of caved in and kind of brought all the materials back to my house, and then my dad kind of set me straight.
As dads are often wont to do.
Exactly. So from there, he and I worked together. So I told him what I was trying to do, and then I just kind of stepped back, and I was his lackey, his assistant, and just did what he told me to do. And so, we started cutting piece by piece, and it was harder than I thought because, there's a lot of angles, and so
Right.
like it's not like a big, like if it's a rectangle, it's easy. You don't have to cut things at funny angles, but most of the front is angular. So you have to make sure everything interlocks perfectly with every other part. The other piece of it that was complicated is that we had like one actual real piece from the arcade machine. So everything had to kind of stem from there. Like all the other measurements had to come from that piece and interlock with that piece. And I also wanted to make it so that if for some reason anyone ever wanted to, that piece could be removed. So that added layers of complexity to what we were trying to do.
So were those measurements that you found, were they accurate to the box that you had?
They were accurate enough. They weren't perfect. So like I found the measurements for the piece that I actually had, they did in fact match. But then other parts didn't quite match. So I had to kind of just make a best guess at it.
Right.
Like actually the math wasn't right. Like if you added up the two pieces, they were like too big. Like just didn't. So there were mistakes in what I found online, but only a few. Like most of it was in fact accurate. And so I did have to take some creative liberties, like the back, for example. I just totally took creative liberties with the back of the machine because with real Pong, you have like these two like huge panels that come off, and it's kind of annoying to remove those and get into the machine. And I was like, you know what? I'd rather just make a door like computer space where you just turn a key and then pull it open and then you can get inside. And so I was like, you know what? It's the back. This is a replica cabinet anyway. I'm going to do what I want. The front was also a little tricky too because there's actually more than one version of the machine, and that was something I learned as I started doing more research on the machine. So some of them have this kick plate that's kind of pushed further back, and then others have it kind of pushed more to the front. And so I picked what I thought was what the older machines look like because what I did learn from repairing this PCB is that this is one of the older Pong arcade machines. It was probably made in the spring of 1973, judging by the chips. And the game was made in November 1972. That was the very first one. So it's an early machine. So I wanted it to be kind of the cabinet to reflect an earlier cabinet. So there were places where I had to take liberties, but I tried to keep that as little as possible. And so slowly it came together. It took about 5 months really from start to finish. And during the course of that, oh man, hang on, my son is not remembering that I'm on this call. Hang on.
Sure.
Okay, I'm not. You can keep reading, or you can do something. Okay, I am not done. Okay. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay, what was I talking about? I was talking about
Turn the mic 180 degrees.
like that.
No, one more. There you go, like that.
Thanks. Yeah. So.
Took about 5 months.
Thanks. Yeah. So it took about 5 months for us to complete the actual cabinet, but during the course of that, we learned also a lot more about the particular Pong that we were fixing, and it actually has a really cool story. So it's not just the fact that it's a Pong arcade machine, which is awesome in and of itself, but but it has a connection to the very origins of the video game industry.
And this is where it gets juicy, folks. So strap yourselves in.
Yeah, that's right. So while I was doing all this work, Bill was trying to contact David All, the original owner of this Pong arcade machine, because he wanted to know, like, how did you get this? What's its story? How did it get so small? All this stuff, because like it's just weird. You don't expect it to be like that, and it's just when you have the original owner, you get to learn things about an arcade machine that you wouldn't normally get otherwise.
Of course.
So David was traveling internationally, so for a while we heard nothing from him. But then eventually he got back to us, and he told us this story that was just unreal. So David, like I was saying before, he was at the very dawn of video games and the very dawn of personal computing. He's one of these people at the nexus of those two realms, and at the very beginning of both. And so he, I don't know how he came to know Nolan Bushnell. But at some point in his life, he got to know and become friends with Nolan Bushnell. And for those of you who do not know, Nolan Bushnell is the founder of Atari. So he's the guy who designed Computer Space, and he helped with designing this game as well. And at the time they designed this game, I think they had 3 employees. It was Ted Dabney, Nolan Bushnell, and Al Alcorn, who was the guy who actually made the game. So somehow Nolan and David knew each other. And as you know, Pong went to become a smash hit. It was incredibly popular. It did what Computer Space could not do, and it made it clear to everybody that video games were something that was wildly popular with the public, and that anyone could understand and access, and that it was extremely commercially viable. So it was not just something for the people who were working on mainframe computers in universities. It was something that companies could make and invest in and reap serious profits from. And as soon as that became realized in like 1972, 73, the floodgates opened. And all these other companies that were making pinball and electromechanical devices like Bally and Midway and Allied Leisure and dozens of others just jumped on the bandwagon. And at first, they jumped on the bandwagon by just straight up copying. So they made literal copies of Pong, because there's nothing proprietary there. You can look at a board, you can copy it perfectly and make the exact same thing. And then some of them eventually started making iterations, and of course Atari meanwhile was innovating. They at first realized, like, we're not going to have the funds to sue these guys, so rather than fight them, we're just going to out innovate them, and that's exactly what they did.
And if you look from any console from the 70s, it's like a Pong, but it's a different version of Pong. They'll call it like hockey or like
handball,
table tennis. Or I've seen so many of them, and I never really looked until we started doing the show. So I always keep my eye out for some cool, weird, old looking stuff to have at the show. Right. But I was absolutely shocked on how everything is just a Pong clone.
Yeah. I don't believe there's any game in the history of video games that was copied so often and by so many people and for so long as Pong. Pong started in 1972, and the final home Pong machine that was made, which we actually have as part of the expo, is the Bentley CompuVision, which was made in 1983. That is like an obscenely long period of time to be copying the exact same thing. Like there's no equivalent to that anywhere else in the history of video games. So yeah, in the beginning, early days, it was the Wild West, and everybody was copying everybody, and the innovation was faster than the law. Like people could innovate before anyone really knew what was legal and what wasn't, and before there were any court cases or anything was decided. And I haven't even gone into it yet, but Pong is absolutely not the first tennis game. There are plenty of precedents that come before it. So one in particular, which created a lot of trouble for Atari, was the Magnavox Odyssey. So the Magnavox Odyssey, for those who don't know, is the first home video game system, and that was made in 1972 as well. It was released a couple of months before Pong, and it was in development all the way up in, I think it started in the late 60s, 67 or 68, when they started making it. It had a table tennis game on it. It's not nearly as good as Pong, but nevertheless, it's very similar. And not only that, when they were doing tech demonstrations and trying to advertise the Magnavox Odyssey, Nolan Bushnell actually attended an event and he played that table tennis game. And he thought, like, this game is terrible, or at least in his opinion, it was terrible. But the concept of a table tennis game was appealing to him. And so what he ended up doing was he went to his new employee, Al Alcorn, and he said, make me a tennis game, a table tennis game, without telling him about the Odyssey, without going into those details. He just gave him some very basic guidelines, and he let him look at the computer space schematics, and he said, okay, this is how video games are made. Go to town, basically. And right. Alcorn did most of the work, and Dabney and Bushnell, they helped him out a little bit. But yeah, that's how Atari's Pong was born. And so Magnavox, they were the first at the bit. They developed the first patents. They got the first, IP, like everything licensed and out there before anybody else. And so, they look back and they of course made money too. They sold about 350,000 Odysseys, not bad. But compared to Pong and compared to these other companies, no, they didn't have nearly as much success. So they kind of waited a bit. They waited for like about a good year or so. And then they started suing the pants off of everybody for patent infringement. So, and of course, including Atari. I mean, they didn't want to sue Atari right away. They waited until they were successful first, and then they went after them because, right. Of course, then they're going to have money.
Yeah, then there's money.
Yeah. So all this happened, and Nolan Bushnell hired lawyers, and at first, Bushnell and the lawyers were confident that they could win this particular fight because there are table tennis games that are video games or video game kind of things that predate the Odyssey too, and so Bushnell hired his friend David All to help him fend off Magnavox during this lawsuit. The lawsuit ended up being like what ended up happening was that the I think it was the court of I forgot which federal court, the one that represents Chicago, was what had jurisdiction over these cases, and then instead of having them like separate, they just combined them into one gigantic case called Bally, or Magnavox versus Bally. And so David testified in this case, and he basically, they were trying to make an argument that there's prior art which invalidates these patents, which is the case. So there is a game called Tennis for Two, which was developed by this guy named William Higginbotham at Brookhaven National Labs here in Long Island. And it's the first table tennis video game, but it's made on an oscilloscope, so it doesn't use a television. And so David was like, neither one of these companies made this table tennis video game idea. It was actually this other guy at Brookhaven National Labs. In the end, what the judge decided was that, yes, that is predating both of these companies, but it doesn't use a TV, and that's kind of a critical component of both the Magnavox device and the Atari devices. And so, it didn't really fit, which is fair.
Right.
But either way, David did what he did, and Atari ended up settling out of court with Magnavox, and people don't know exactly how much they paid, but they probably paid something between like $500,000 to $1 million to Magnavox, and then they made them, and then they were licensed by Magnavox to make their Pong games. So that allowed them to continue innovating and continue doing what they were doing. And at the time, Atari was becoming successful, but it was still relatively small. So Bushnell didn't really have spare cash lying around where he could pay David, and so he asked David, would you take a Pong arcade machine instead of payment? And David said yes, and that is the Pong arcade machine that I just fixed, that's going to be at the Cradle of Aviation for their upcoming Arcade Age exhibit, and will be at the Long Island Retro Gaming Expo this year. So that's crazy.
So this machine was a personal gift from Nolan to his lawyer, I guess, or his
to his friend David,
to his friend who helped him in the legal case.
Yeah.
Wow, that is what a story! Like, what a journey for that machine.
Yeah, it's something you don't normally find these things out about consoles or arcades. Like, you might find one out there, and you don't know who got it first, how it happened. But this particular one has this like direct link to some of the founding fathers of video games. I mean, it's connected to Bushnell. It's connected to this lawsuit, which was one of the very first, one of the big ones. And to David too. And David, in his own right, has an important story to tell about the early history of computing and the early history of video games. So it's really one of a kind. I'll never see anything rarer than this because it's the only one in the world.
I mean, never say never, but yeah, it's pretty. Well, we got to put a nice like sign telling that story next to it at the show because that's really something else.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, because I mean, it is. I mean, even if it was just a regular Pong machine that was in some amusement place or a bar, that's great.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Fine by me too. It's Pong. It's still very special. But this game has a real connection to some of the key players that started this, that created what we love here, and it's back to life, and it's in an arcade cabinet, and I did my best to make it as accurate and true to the time period as possible, and better yet, it's not just going to sit there in a museum. It's something that we can all play and interact with and enjoy. You just played it yourself this afternoon.
I did. It was it felt good. It looked good. It was very impressive, like top to bottom.
Thanks.
And it was cool seeing, like, I know it's a reproduction cabinet, but I mean it looks like a cabinet and it looks like a brand new original cabinet. And they don't make things these days the way they made things in the 70s. So, like, aesthetically, so you wouldn't walk into somewhere and see a really weird 70s style, thing, just like you wouldn't see a 70s style living room, in today's houses. So seeing, like, a brand new, it was like stepping into, like, a time warp,
Yeah, it is. It's a weird, I mean, I've had that feeling, too. When the final pieces were coming together, and I was just looking at it, and this, like, because we have, like, a group discussion for the expo, and I was sharing pictures all the time, and it was because I was having that feeling, like it was like stepping back in time, because it has that aesthetic, that yellow paint, those angles, the wood grain, that whole combination of features that nothing gets made like that anymore, and it looks so clean and crisp. It looks like either you found a Pong arcade machine that was in storage since the 70s, has never been touched by humans, since it came off the factory, or like you travel back in time or something. It's just a cool feeling.
Bill, it came from Bill, right?
Yeah, Bill Ainge.
Yeah, Bill, if you're listening, thank you. Thank you for lending us this thing. And has Bill seen it?
He hasn't in person, not yet, but I have been sending him pictures. He's actually been having quite a stint of travel himself lately, so he is back in home now, and I know that he plans to come in February to see it. But yeah, we've been speaking. I think he's pretty speechless and happy about the whole thing too.
Awesome.
And I think this is a story that both he and I want to tell together. We've been talking about writing something up. As you know, I've been putting together a 2-part video series on this restoration just because of the unique story, and so we want to kind of get it out there and let people know that this exists. It's interesting, and it's a piece of history that you can enjoy and interact with yourself.
So if anyone wants to see or play this thing, you will have, as George mentioned, there will be a number of opportunities. The Cradle of Aviation's Arcade Age exhibit is coming back for a limited time engagement starting February 15th to April 19th, I believe.
Correct.
I think it's only on weekends and then like special days during the week, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's not continuous through the week.
Right.
It's primarily weekends and like during the school breaks and such.
Right. And they do these things called 80s arcade and karaoke nights. There's 2 of them, one in February, one in March. They're on a Saturday night. There's karaoke. There's arcades. Obviously, it's in the title. We're there with some console free play. They got a bar, and it's a lot of fun. And then you will also be able to play it at the Long Island Tabletop Gaming Expo on April 18th. It will be in the video game section. And
That's
the
right.
Long Island Retro Gaming Expo coming up August 8th and 9th of this year.
So
I
this
can't.
year's a good time.
when Bill comes down, let me know. I'd love to come meet you guys. I want to see the look on his face when he sees it.
Me too.
If I'm not there, get a picture.
I will keep you posted and I want to be there too for that moment, because I mean, like, he's been seeing the pictures, he's been, putting them up on Twitter, he's been very excited, but you've seen the pictures too. It's very different when you see it in person.
Oh yeah. How long has he had this thing? Do you know?
I do. He got it in April of last year.
He just got it.
He just got it. He made attempts to get it working. He couldn't get it to work. And then, a few months later, he met you and I, and that just put us on this trajectory where now it's finished and perfect. Wow. As perfect as I could make it.
So it's so cool. It's a year ago, I would have never thought that if you told me, a year from now, you're going to have a beautiful working computer space and a Pong machine that Nolan Bushnell gave some dude, you're out of your mind. And here we are, like, what's going to happen a year from now? I wonder what kind of crazy stuff's going to pop up. This is really fun, being in this world. This is really cool.
Yeah, this time and place that we're in right now is great, because I know when the expo was smaller, you had to do a lot of hunting for unique and rare items, and of course we still do that, and we're always searching for things that are special and interesting, but it's now at a point where things come to us, and we have the tools and the resources to make them work again if we need to, and that's the mission of one of the missions of what we're doing.
Yeah, and to give them the justice that they deserve. Yeah, it's so cool. Excellent work, George. I can't
Thanks you.
If I could get 50 people in here to give you a standing ovation, which maybe we'll be able to do at some point. Really, I mean, you blew my mind with this one. You blew my mind with computer space, but I mean, this is, I'm not going to say it's on another level, but it's on some kind of, huge level that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, like I said, I don't know when I'm ever going to be able to work on something this rare, because, well, this is as rare as it gets. This is the only machine like this with a story like this.
Right.
There's no equivalent.
Well, there are other machines with other stories, so let's see if we can find them.
I hope we can. We can.
Do you know when your video series about this is going to come out?
Yeah, so I have part 1 dropping this coming Friday. So
nice.
So I'll be using that time mostly just to tell the story of where this machine came from. And kind of combining it with just some images and, give people a feel for I try to do something kind of like Gaming Historian does on YouTube, like just give a nice narrative of where this machine came from. And then in the second part, I'm going to go into the nuts and bolts of what I did, how I made the machine look the way it looks now.
So it's kind of like a mix-up of George History and Fix It Fridays.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I will link those videos in this video on YouTube when they get released. And George, I can't thank you enough for coming back on. And,
yeah, of course, pleasure.
You make these super easy, which is nice. And I look forward to seeing what kind of wacky rabbits you're going to pull out of your hat next.
Yeah, me too. I can't wait to have something else planned. It's always good.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone listening, for joining us and supporting us. And we hope you can come down soon and check this thing out. This thing being the Pong machine.
Definitely. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Take it easy, everybody.